The morning everything fell apart, I was wearing my lucky hoodie. I know how that sounds. I know it's a ridiculous detail to lead with, considering what came next. But I want you to understand that when I walked onto that campus at 7:43 in the morning, the sky still pale gray, coffee still hot in my hand, the biggest day of my academic life finally here, I believed things were going to be okay. I believed it because I was wearing the same gray hoodie I'd worn the night I wrote the first version of the algorithm. The night Paige had leaned over my shoulder, read 3 lines of code, and whispered, "This is going to change everything." I believed her. I should have understood right then that the people who say things like "this is going to change everything" are often the ones most willing to change the story of how it got there. The auditorium doors were at the far end of the main building. I had walked that corridor probably 800 times over the past 3 years. I knew exactly which floor tiles clicked under your feet and which ones were silent. I knew the light above the third door from the left flickered every 40 seconds. I knew the security desk guard on early shifts was usually Thomas, a 60-year-old man who liked baseball and hated slow walkers, and that he would nod at me and wave me through the way he always did, the way he'd done every morning for 3 years. But Thomas wasn't there that morning. A different guard was at the desk, younger, expressionless. I swiped my access card at the reader by the corridor entrance, the same card I had used 400 times, and the light on the reader flashed red. I frowned, swiped again, red. "Sir," the guard was already standing. "That badge is deactivated." I stared at him. "That's not possible. I'm a student here. I have a final presentation today, in that auditorium, in 40 minutes. "I understand, but that access card is deactivated in our system. There has to be a mistake. Can you call someone? The registrar's office, the department?" "Sir?" His voice was flat and practiced, the voice of someone who has been trained not to argue. "I need you to step back from the entrance." I stood very still. The coffee in my hand was suddenly too hot, or maybe it was my hand that had gone cold. I looked past him, down the long corridor, at the double doors to the auditorium at the end. The lights inside were on. People were moving behind the glass panels in the walls. The competition was setting up. 3 years of work were behind those doors. "I'm not leaving," I said. He took a step toward me, and another guard appeared from somewhere to my left, and within 60 seconds I was standing on the steps outside the building, on the wrong side of a glass wall, watching the rest of my life happen without me. And here is the part I still cannot fully describe to anyone who hasn't experienced it. There is a specific kind of horror in watching something be taken from you in real time, not stolen in the dark, the way theft usually happens, but in broad daylight, in public, with people applauding. I found a position along the glass wall of the auditorium where I could see the main presentation screen. The judges were seated at a long table. Faculty members were in rows behind them. The 5 competing teams were at the side, waiting. I saw the presentation slide deck appear on the screen. I recognized it immediately. The color scheme, the layout, the exact font I had spent 40 minutes selecting because Paige had said it needs to look serious, not like a student project. I pressed my palm flat against the glass. Standing at the podium was Paige. She had dressed differently than I had ever seen her dress for class. Professional, composed, her hair pulled back. She was speaking to the judges with the kind of easy authority that you either have or you don't. And Paige had always had it. That was one of the first things I noticed about her when we met. The ability to walk into a room and make the room adjust to her. Beside her, leaning against the edge of the presenter's table with the casual posture of a man who has never once worried about anything in his life, was Victor. Victor Hayes, the rector's son, the student whose family had donated the building we were currently standing in, the student who had failed 3 courses and faced no academic consequences, the student who drove a different car depending on his mood and whose smile had a specific quality to it, the quality of a person who understands that the world is arranged for his convenience. I had spoken to Victor exactly once before that morning. 6 weeks earlier, he had appeared at the library table where Paige and I were working and asked, not us, specifically Paige, whether our project was the one everyone's talking about. Paige had smiled at him in a way I didn't fully process at the time. I understand it now. Victor was presenting. Victor, my algorithm, my code, my 3 years of iterative development, debugging, restructuring, rewriting. He was presenting it with the same relaxed confidence he brought to everything, and the judges were leaning forward, and people were nodding. And from outside the glass, I could see exactly what this looked like to every person in that room. It looked like a triumph. Tell me, what would you have done at that moment? Just drop a comment below. Because I have asked myself that question 10,000 times, and I still don't fully know if what I did next was the right thing. I went back to the entrance. I told the guard my name. I told him I was a registered student and I was being unlawfully prevented from attending my own academic competition. I asked him to call the department head. He said he would relay the message. I told him I would wait. I waited 20 minutes. No one came. I found a different entrance on the east side of the building, a service entrance I knew was usually propped open by the maintenance staff. I got inside. I made it as far as the corridor outside the auditorium before 2 guards, not 1, 2, appeared and walked me back out. This time they were less polite about it. I stood on the steps for the second time and called Paige's number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I sent a text. What is happening? What did you do? Call me. She read it. I watched the read receipt appear. She didn't respond. Inside the auditorium, the judges were deliberating. Inside the auditorium, 20 minutes later, they announced the winner. Paige and Victor's team. I watched through the glass as people applauded. As Paige accepted an envelope, the kind of envelope that contains a check for $500,000. As Victor shook hands with the faculty judges with the practiced ease of a man who was born knowing how to do that. As the rector, Victor's father, stood in the back row watching his son with an expression of composed, satisfied pride. I watched all of it. I didn't move. And then something else happened. Something I wasn't expecting because I had been so focused on the theft, on the shock, that I had not yet thought about what came next. A faculty member I didn't recognize approached the judging table and spoke quietly to the head judge. The judge's expression changed. He said something to the other judges. One of them picked up a phone. 5 minutes later, the head of campus security walked into the auditorium. He spoke to the judges. He spoke to Victor. Victor nodded and said something, and then he opened a laptop and showed something to the panel. A document or a file. I couldn't see what. The judges looked at it. Their expressions shifted into something careful and official. The head of security turned and looked through the glass, directly at me. He walked out through a side door and around to the steps where I was standing. "Are you Daniel Ward?" he asked. "Yes. I need you to come with me. I want you to pause here with me for a moment, because what came next was something I was unprepared for. Not the fact of it, but the speed. How quickly an institution can process a human being. How efficiently a university, a place ostensibly dedicated to truth and intellectual integrity, can hear one side of a story and act on it before the other side has said a single word. They brought me to the dean's office. The dean of the engineering faculty was a methodical man named Dr. Price. Not warm, not unkind, simply the kind of administrator who treats every situation as a procedural matter requiring procedural resolution. He had a printed document on his desk when I walked in. He had clearly already read it. "Sit down, please," he said. I sat. He told me that the university had received documentation, submitted earlier that morning, indicating that the code at the center of my competition entry had not been independently developed, that the source code bore structural similarities to proprietary algorithms developed in the university's Advanced Systems Research Lab, that an analysis of lab access logs showed unauthorized access to those systems, access traced to my student credentials, over a period of 8 weeks. I stared at him. "That's fabricated," I said. Every line of that code is mine. I have version history going back 2 years. The documentation is specific, he said, and it was submitted by a co-registrant on the competition entry. Paige, she had submitted it, or Victor had, using evidence that Paige had helped construct. I didn't know then which of them had been the architect. I found out much later, but in that office the effect was the same. The fabricated access logs were convincing. They had my student ID number. They had timestamps. They had been constructed by someone who understood the university's systems well enough to make the forgery credible. And of course they had, because they had used my own code to do it. The irony of that did not escape me then. It does not escape me now. Dr. Price told me the university was opening a formal investigation into academic fraud. He told me that pending the investigation's outcome, my enrollment was suspended effective immediately. He told me my campus access had been revoked. He told me that given the severity of the allegations, the suspension was likely to be permanent. I sat in that chair, and I did not speak for a very long time. When I finally did, I said, I built that system from scratch over 3 years. Every line of code, every revision, every debugging session, I can prove it. I have documentation going back to my first semester. You're welcome to present that documentation during the investigation process, Dr. Price said. When does the investigation begin? We'll contact you with a timeline. They never contacted me. The investigation, such as it was, concluded 2 weeks later with a finding of academic fraud. I know this because I received a letter. Not a call, not a meeting. A letter, mailed to the address on file for my student record, which was still my mother's address 300 miles away, which meant I only found out the investigation had concluded when she called me crying, because she had opened a piece of mail addressed to me. I was 22 years old. I had no money for a lawyer. I had no institutional support. I had been expelled from the one institution whose credential I needed to prove to the world that the work I could do was worth something. And I had nobody left to call. I need to tell you something before I go further. Because the story I just described, the betrayal, the expulsion, the theft, that would be enough, wouldn't it? That would be sufficient reason to spend the rest of your life consumed by rage, or defeated, or both. I was consumed by rage. I want to be honest about that. I'm not going to tell you I handled what happened with wisdom or grace or any particular dignity. I was 22 years old, and I had just watched the person I loved most in the world hand my life's work to someone else and then walk out of a building and get into his car without looking at me. I'm going to tell you what I did instead. But first, I need you to understand something about what I was thinking as I stood outside that building for the last time, watching Victor's silver car pull out of the parking lot with Paige in the passenger seat. I was thinking, I will not forget this. I will not move on from this. I will not heal from this and forgive and find peace. I am going to carry this with me until I understand exactly what they built on top of what they stole from me. And then I am going to be there when it falls. I did not know, standing on that pavement at 22 with $20 in my pocket, and no idea where I was going to sleep that night, how long that would take. It took 11 years, but I was there. When it fell, I was the reason it fell, and I was the one who decided what happened next. That's the story I'm going to tell you. I grew up in a house where the heat went out twice every winter. Not because we didn't have heat, we did, but because the system was old and unreliable, and repairing it cost money that we reliably didn't have. My mother worked at a pharmacy. My father had left when I was 9. Not dramatically, not with a scene, just quietly and completely, the way some men do, leaving behind a small debt and a habit of absence that I spent years trying not to inherit. My older brother Aaron worked construction from the age of 18, and still found ways to give me $10 or $20 on my birthday, the way you do when you're proud of someone and broke at the same time. We weren't the poorest family in our town, and I want to be precise about that, because I'm not trying to make this a story of extreme deprivation. We were the family where the math never quite worked, where a car repair could mean a month without anything that wasn't a necessity, where my mother went to bed some nights before dinner because she was tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. That particular kind of poverty, the functional kind, the kind that looks almost okay from the outside, teaches you something that pure destitution doesn't. It teaches you that the difference between surviving and not surviving is very often a single skill that someone else doesn't have. My skill was code. I don't know exactly when I understood that I was different from other kids in this one specific way. I know it was before middle school. I had found an old laptop in a box at a church rummage sale. $4, barely operational. And I had spent most of a summer figuring out how to make it work, how to make it do things, how to speak to it in a language it understood. Programming languages were like that for me, immediately legible. Where other people saw syntax and structure and memorization, I saw logic. I saw relationships. I saw the way one thing follows necessarily from another if you understand the rules well enough. By high school, I had taught myself 4 languages from library books and free online resources. By 16, I had built a small application that helped my mother track her pharmacy inventory more efficiently. Nothing fancy but functional. And she used it for 2 years before her employer replaced it with a commercial system. That was the first time I understood that what I built with my mind could have real-world utility, that it wasn't just abstraction, that it worked. I got a partial scholarship to a state university 300 miles from home. Partial meant I still needed loans. Loans meant I still needed to work. I worked, first at a campus coffee shop, then as a lab assistant in the computer science department, then as a freelance developer for small businesses that needed websites and had very small budgets. I ate a lot of pasta. I wore the same 4 shirts for 2 years. I did not go to parties. I did not have a social life to speak of. I had my work, and my work was good. My professors knew it. My lab supervisor, a compact, precise man named Professor Reynolds, who had been at the university for 30 years and was not easily impressed, told me in my second year that I had a structural instinct for systems architecture that he had seen in perhaps 2 or 3 students over his entire career. He said it the way he said everything, flatly, without sentiment, as if he were reporting a measurement. Coming from him, it meant more than any other compliment I had ever received. I was not popular. I was not confident in rooms full of people. I was not the kind of person who walked into places and made adjustments happen. I was the kind of person who sat in the back of seminar rooms and wrote more notes than anyone else, and then went home and spent 3 more hours thinking about what had been said. I had a small number of acquaintances and 0 close friends in my first year and a half at university. And then I met Paige. I met Paige Monroe in the spring of my sophomore year, in a seminar on human-computer interaction that I'd enrolled in partly for credit and partly because the professor had written a paper I found genuinely interesting. Paige was in the front row. She was not a computer science student. She was studying business with a technology focus, the kind of interdisciplinary major that CS purists sometimes look down on, and that was, in practice, often more useful than pure theory. She had a quality I recognized immediately and could not have named at the time. She understood people the way I understood systems. She could read a room the way I could read a code base. We were paired for a seminar project. We met in the library 3 times a week for 6 weeks. By the end of the project, I had developed something I had never experienced before in relation to another person, a kind of dependency, an orientation toward her presence, a specific discomfort when she wasn't in the room. I didn't know what to do with it. I had no template for it. I had been so inside my own head for so long that the experience of caring about someone else's opinion of me was genuinely disorienting. She asked me once, during one of our library sessions, what I was really working on. Not the seminar project, my real project, the one I disappeared into after our sessions ended. I told her about the algorithm. I had been developing it for over a year at that point. It was a predictive systems architecture, a framework for identifying and resolving inefficiencies in complex institutional networks. In practical terms, it meant that a large organization, a university, a hospital, a corporation, could use my system to identify where its processes were leaking resources, time, or money before those leaks became critical failures. It was not a simple idea. It was not a simple implementation, but it was mine, from the ground up, and I believed in it with a certainty that I had never felt about anything except coding itself. Paige listened to me explain it for 45 minutes. She asked questions, smart questions, not technical ones, but strategic ones. Who would buy this? What does the market look like? How do you position a B2B infrastructure product to enterprise buyers who are resistant to change? I didn't have answers to most of them, and I told her that. You need a business partner, she said. I don't work well with other people, I said. You work fine with me, she said. She was right, I did. It was the only time I'd ever worked fine with another person. We became partners. We became, about a month after that conversation, something more than partners. Though it developed slowly and without any dramatic declaration, the way things develop between two people who spend most of their waking hours in the same room working toward the same goal. I don't think I had the architecture for romance in any conventional sense. What I had was Paige, and Paige was enough. In my junior year, the university announced the Carter Innovation Competition, an annual event for which that year's prize had been elevated to $500,000 in development funding, thanks to a donation from an alumnus. Teams of 2 to 4 students competed with original technology concepts judged on innovation, technical feasibility, and commercial viability. The winner would receive the grant, plus incubator access and faculty mentorship. We entered. Of course we entered. We had been building toward something exactly like this for 2 years. We worked on the entry for 8 months. I rewrote the core algorithm 3 times to make it more demonstrable within the constraints of a competition setting. Paige developed the business case, the market positioning, the go-to-market strategy. She built the pitch deck. She ran practice, presentations in our apartment kitchen, talking to an imaginary panel of judges while I sat on the counter eating cereal and asking the hardest questions I could think of. She was extraordinary at it. Whatever I had built technically, she could translate into language that made the judges lean forward. We were good together. I believed that completely. I believed it right up until the moment the access card stopped working. Drop a comment below. Did you see it coming? Because the signs were there, and I didn't see them. I want to know, what would you have done differently? Let me tell you about the signs, because they were there. I know they were there because when I replay those last 2 weeks before the competition, I can see them with the ruthless clarity that hindsight provides. At the time, I explained each one away. I want to be honest about that. Not because I want sympathy, but because I think a lot of people watching this have been in a version of that situation, trusting someone so completely that the evidence of the opposite feels like an error in your own perception rather than a fact about the world. Victor Hayes entered our orbit about 6 weeks before the competition. He was not, on paper, a person who had any reason to be interested in a competition he couldn't win. Victor was not a technology student. Victor's academic record was a matter of campus-wide rumor. 3 failed courses, 2 academic warnings, no research record of any kind. What Victor had was his father's name, his father's money, and the specific magnetism of a person who has never been told no about anything important. He was genuinely charming in the way that some people are charming, effortlessly, carelessly, as a default mode of being rather than as a considered performance. He started appearing in places where Paige and I worked, the library, the engineering building cafe, a seminar we both happened to be attending. Each time he spoke primarily to Paige. He was friendly to me in the distracted way that people are friendly to objects in a room that don't require their attention. The first time I noticed something, I filed it away wrong. It was late, maybe 11 at night, and I was in the lab, deep in a debugging session, and I texted Paige to ask if she had updated the market analysis section of the deck. She took 40 minutes to respond, which was unusual. She was always fast with messages. When she responded, she said she'd been at the library. I checked the library access logs. I had access to them through my lab assistant role, and her student card had not been swiped that evening. I noticed this. I did not act on it. I told myself there were 100 explanations. The second sign, she started arriving late to our work sessions, not by much, 10, 15 minutes, and always with a reasonable explanation: traffic, a phone call from home, a meeting with a professor. Each explanation was plausible. The cumulative pattern was less so. The third sign, one evening, working together in the apartment, her phone lit up on the table between us. I didn't intend to read the screen. I glanced at it reflexively the way you do when something lights up near you. The name I saw before she scooped the phone up was V. "Who's V?" I asked. "What?" She was looking at her screen. "The contact who just texted you, V." "Oh, Valerie from my business cohort." She smiled at me. "Easy, natural. She's been stressed about finals. I've been checking in on her." I nodded. I did not know a Valerie in Paige's business cohort. I had met most of her cohort at events. I thought perhaps I'd simply forgotten. The fourth sign, and the most obvious, happened 5 days before the competition. I had been working late and came home at about 1 in the morning to find Paige asleep on the couch, her phone face down on the cushion beside her. I moved it to the coffee table. When I set it down, the screen lit up with a notification preview. The name on the notification was not Valerie. The notification was not a text. I stood in the dark living room and I looked at that notification for 10 seconds, and then I set the phone down face down and went to bed and lay there until 4 in the morning, unable to sleep and unable to think clearly and unable to do the one thing that the rational part of my mind was telling me I needed to do. Because here is the truth that I could not face at 22. I was afraid to confront Paige, not because I didn't know what was happening, but because I did know. I knew the way you know something you are not ready to act on. Confronting her would have required me to be ready, and I wasn't ready because Paige was the only person in my life. She was my partner. She was my first relationship. She was the business co-founder of a competition entry that was 7 days from its final presentation, and the part of my brain that could not afford to lose her had appointed itself, the editor of the part of my brain that could see clearly. So I said nothing. When she asked 2 days later why I seemed quiet, I said I was just stressed about the competition. She said, "Stop worrying, we're going to win." I believed her. I believed her right up until the access card. Here is what happened in the 24 hours after I was handed the expulsion letter. I went to my apartment. I sat on the floor of my room, not on the bed, on the floor back against the wall, for approximately 4 hours. I did not eat. I did not sleep. I thought, with a precision that surprised me, about exactly what had been taken, how it had been taken, and by whom. Paige had been the only person outside myself with access to the full project files. She had the repository password. She had copies of every draft, every revision, every notebook I had filled with development notes over 2 years. She had access to my technical documentation because I had given it to her voluntarily, because I trusted her, because she was the person I trusted most in the world. She had not stolen my idea. Let me be precise about that. She had taken my fully developed, nearly complete, competition-ready system, my code, my documentation, my business analysis, which she had built alongside me, and handed it to a man with money and connections and no technical competence of his own, who had then used those connections to have me removed from the building and accused of stealing it. I called Paige at 11 that night. She picked up on the second ring. "I know you're upset," she said. She sounded calm, not cold exactly, but contained, the voice of someone who has already made a decision and moved past the difficult part. "I want to understand something," I said. "Not the why, the what. Did you give Victor the code?" A silence. "It's more complicated than—" "Did you give him the code, Paige?" Another silence, shorter. "He had resources we didn't have," she said. "Access we didn't have. We couldn't have gotten the grant on our own, not to the level that we built it on our own, I said. That was the entire point. The point is where it ends up. The point is what it becomes. I had nothing to say to that. I don't mean that I was speechless. I mean I literally could not find a response that fit inside the framework of the conversation she was offering me, because the framework she was offering me was one in which what she had done was a strategic decision rather than a betrayal, and I could not operate in that framework. You fabricated the access logs, I said. She said nothing. Victor's family's IT department, or someone they hired. They built a fake access log trail using my student credentials to make it look like I accessed the lab's proprietary systems. You gave them the information they needed to make the logs convincing. I didn't know how far it would... She stopped. How far what would go? Silence. Paige. My voice was very quiet. I'm 22. I have no money. I have no degree now. I have nothing. I'm sorry, she said. It sounded like a fact, not a feeling. Are you with him? A long pause. Then, yes. I ended the call. I sat on the floor of my room for another 3 hours. At some point, it must have been after 3 in the morning, I opened my laptop. Not to work on anything. Just because the screen was a kind of light I could sit in front of that didn't require anything from me. I scrolled through the repository of the project, every commit, every version, going back to the very first lines of code I had written 2 years earlier. It was all there, my work, every hour of it. I saved a complete archived copy to an external drive. Then I looked at the screen for a while longer, and I thought, I don't know when, but I am going to need this. I closed the laptop. I slept for 4 hours. In the morning, I started packing. The first thing you need to understand about the years that followed is that they were not cinematic. I want to be very clear about that, because I have heard versions of this kind of story, the comeback story, the rebuilding narrative, and they always have a certain quality to them, a montage quality, a sense that the hard years were a compressed prelude, dramatically scored, leading somewhere that justifies the difficulty. They were not like that. They were long, and they were quiet, and they were full of small, undignified failures that nobody saw, and that I was not going to be forgiven for by any audience, because there was no audience. There was only the grind and the silence and the code. I left the city where the university was. I couldn't afford the rent anyway. My student loan payments would begin in 6 months, and without a degree, the career trajectory I had planned was not going to materialize on any timeline I could use. I moved to a different city, 3 hours away. I found a room in a shared house with 4 other people I barely spoke to. I found a job, night shift at a distribution warehouse. I won't make this more than it was. It was physical work. It was shift work. It was the kind of labor that is invisible because it happens while other people are sleeping. The moving and sorting and loading of things that people ordered online and will receive at their door without ever thinking about the building it came from or the people inside it. I worked 4 nights a week, 12-hour shifts, because that was what the night differential paid, and the night differential was what I needed to make rent and loan payments, with enough left over to eat. During the days, I slept. Not all day. I slept 5 or 6 hours, the maximum I could reliably get before the apartment got too loud, and then I was awake. And when I was awake, I worked on the code. The laptop I had was 4 years old and failing. The battery held 40 minutes of charge. The cooling fan made a specific grinding noise that told me I had approximately 6 to 8 months before the hard drive died. I kept the drive backed up obsessively. To an external drive, to a cloud service I paid $6 a month for, to another external drive that I kept in a different location. I had already had everything stolen once. I was not going to let the machinery of bad luck add to the theft. I rebuilt the algorithm from the ground up. Not because there was anything wrong with the original was good, but because the original existed in a form that could be contested, that had been contaminated by the question of its ownership, that lived in a repository that Victor and Paige had also had access to. I needed a version that was provably, documentably, indisputably mine. I needed version histories with timestamps. I needed a development log so detailed that no fabricated access record could contradict it. I needed the code to exist in a form where its authorship was not a question. I also needed to make it better, because the one thing that Victor and Paige had given me, inadvertently, cruelly, completely without understanding what they were doing, was time. They had taken everything else, but they had given me the next several years to think without distraction about what the algorithm was, what its limitations were, what it could become if someone devoted their full attention to it rather than using it as a competition entry. I sat in that room, nights I wasn't working, days I couldn't sleep, and I thought, I wrote, I rewrote, I documented everything with a thoroughness that would have seemed paranoid to anyone watching, if anyone had been watching. No one was watching. I want to tell you about what it does to you, that particular combination of circumstances. The unfair expulsion, the isolation, the grinding work. Because I think it is important to be honest about it, rather than to present it as a period of quiet, heroic development. It broke some things in me that have not fully healed. Trust, most obviously. I had trusted one person. The person I trusted had used my trust as the precise mechanism of the theft. The access she had, that made the betrayal possible, came entirely from the fact that I had given her full access to everything, because I trusted her. The lesson that event taught the part of me that makes decisions was very clear, very permanent, and very difficult to undo. Do not give anyone access to what you are building. Not because people are necessarily malicious, not because collaboration is worthless, but because you cannot know in advance which people are malicious, and the cost of finding out the wrong way is too high. I became very difficult to know. Not by choice or not consciously. It was more that the habits of connection I'd had before atrophied in the years when there was no one to connect with. I went to work, I came home, I coded, I ate, I slept. I did this for months and then for years, and the years accumulated in the way that only years of discipline accumulate, which is slowly and without fanfare and with a great deal of doubt in the middle. The doubt was the hardest part. I want to say that to anyone watching who is in a version of a hard period, because I think the doubt gets underrepresented in these stories. It's easy to tell the story from the other end, from the position of knowing that it worked out, that the grind had a destination. Living through it, the doubt is constant. The question is always the same. What if I am just a person who got hurt and is now wasting years of his life on an anger project that will never amount to anything? I didn't have an answer to that question for a long time. I had the work, and I had the habit of the work, and I kept going because stopping felt worse. That was the honest reason, not inspiration, not clarity of vision, just the fact that the alternative, giving up and admitting that what they had done had ended me, was something I could not live with. I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever kept going at something not because you believed in it in some pure, uncomplicated way, but simply because quitting felt like letting the wrong people win? Drop it in the comments, because that kept me alive for about 3 years, and I want to know if I'm the only one. In my second year in that city, a small thing happened that changed the trajectory of what I was doing. I had picked up some freelance development work, small jobs, the kind that pay a few $100s and don't require credentials or references, found through online marketplaces where clients post specific requests and developers bid for them. I was underbidding. I was doing this deliberately because I needed to build a client history and portfolio without a degree, and that meant accepting lower rates than my work was worth until I had enough completed projects to justify higher ones. One of those small jobs was for a logistics company, a regional distributor. Nothing. Large, 30 employees. They needed a custom inventory management system, and their budget was small. I built them something better than their budget warranted, because I could not turn my attention to a problem and do a mediocre job at it. The owner, a practical, skeptical man named Mr. Cooper, who had no particular interest in technology and just wanted his inventory problem solved, was so satisfied with the result that he referred me to 3 other businesses in his network. From those 3 referrals came 6 more. From those 6 came the beginning of something that I had not planned and could not have planned. A reputation. Not a large reputation. Not a formal one. The reputation of someone in a specific community, small and medium business owners, primarily in logistics and operations, who builds systems that actually work and doesn't charge more than you can afford and doesn't disappear after the project is done. The reputation of a reliable person who does what he says he will do. I am emphasizing this because I want to be precise about how power actually accumulates in the real world for people who don't start with money or connections. It does not accumulate in dramatic moments. It accumulates in the aggregation of 1,000 small kept promises. Every project completed on time, every client question answered, every follow-up made, every problem solved without being asked to solve it. Power accumulates the way compound interest accumulates, invisibly, slowly, and then all at once. By the end of my 3rd year in that city, I had enough client work to leave the warehouse. I gave my notice on a Wednesday night, worked my last shift on a Friday, and went home and slept for 11 hours. When I woke up, I felt something that I had not felt in a very long time. I felt like myself again, or not exactly like myself, like a version of myself that had been stress-tested so thoroughly that some things had burned away and what remained was harder and clearer and much less afraid of difficulty. I quit the freelance work model and formally registered a company. I named it Arcline Systems. I rented a small office space, barely an office, more a partitioned section of a shared workspace, hired my first employee, a developer named Caleb, who was fresh out of a coding boot camp and was more useful than I expected, and began bidding on larger contracts. I worked 16-hour days for the first year of running Arcline properly. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Because I was finally running at full capacity, with full attention, towards something that was mine. I want to pause here and tell you about something I was doing in parallel. Something I had never stopped doing, even in the warehouse years. I was watching. Every 6 months or so, I searched for information about Victor Hayes and Paige Monroe. Not obsessively, or if it was obsessive, it was a quiet obsession, a low-grade monitoring rather than an active preoccupation. I had alerts set up. I watched for their names in news aggregators, in professional publications, in the public financial filings that tech companies in certain revenue brackets are required to submit. For the first 4 years, what I found was consistent with what I expected. Victor and Paige had used the competition grant and Victor's family connections to found a technology company called Halcyon Systems. The company's stated focus was enterprise process optimization, which is a description so close to what my algorithm had been designed to do that reading it on a company website felt like a physical impact. They had grown quickly. Victor's father had leveraged his institutional relationships to bring in early corporate clients. Paige's business acumen, which was real, whatever else she was, had shaped the commercial strategy. The company had received 2 rounds of private investment and was reportedly expanding its development team. Victor and Paige were, also, by all available indications, together. Publicly together, photographs at industry events, professional profiles listing them as co-founders, and then a small announcement in a business publication about their marriage. I read that announcement 3 times. I did not feel what I expected to feel. I had expected rage or grief or some combination. What I felt was closer to finality. The last possible version of the story in which any of it had been accidental, in which Paige had not meant what she did, had been somehow coerced or manipulated into it. Dissolved when I read that announcement. She had built a life with the person for whom she had destroyed mine. That was not an accident or a mistake or a moment of weakness. It was a choice. I filed that information somewhere inside me that was not warm and was not cold and was simply operational, and I went back to work. It was in my 5th year, working late in the Arcline office, that I found the thing that changed everything. I had been looking at Halcyon's latest financial filing, a routine check, the kind I did every 6 months. But this filing was different from the previous ones in a way that I noticed immediately, because financial documents are, in a certain way, like code. They have an underlying logic. The numbers express relationships. When those relationships don't hold, when the arithmetic of a company's reported performance doesn't map cleanly to the structure of its operations, it registers to someone who reads them closely the way a compiler error registers. Something is wrong. Something doesn't fit. Halcyon's growth numbers were extraordinary. Their revenue had tripled in 2 years. Their client roster had expanded dramatically. Their valuation in the most recent funding round was a number that, for a company of their size and age, required an explanation. The explanation they provided was the algorithm. My algorithm, repurposed, rebranded as their proprietary system, presented in their corporate materials as Halcyon's core technology. The explanation was that their product simply worked better than anything else on the market, and that enterprise clients recognized this and were willing to pay premium pricing. This explanation was partially true. The algorithm did work, but the numbers still didn't hold. I spent 3 weeks analyzing every public document Halcyon had ever filed, every press release, every investment announcement, every corporate partnership disclosure. At the end of 3 weeks, I had a conclusion. The company's reported growth was not real, at least not in the way they were reporting it. The revenue figures included contracts that, based on the public disclosure information of the companies listed as Halcyon's clients, did not match anything those companies had actually spent on technology infrastructure. Some of those companies were subsidiaries of Victor's father's broader business network, entities that could be directed to report contracts that had not been executed at arm's length, that may not have been executed at all in any meaningful commercial sense. In other words, Halcyon's spectacular growth was, in significant part, a constructed fiction, a bubble, an edifice of falsified performance designed to attract investors, raise valuation, and create the appearance of a company that was too successful to fail. I sat with this understanding for a long time. I turned it over. I examined it from different angles. I looked for alternative explanations. There weren't any. The company that Victor and Paige had built on top of my algorithm, the company that was supposed to be proof that the theft had worked, that they had made something of what they had taken, was rotten underneath. It was a performance of success rather than success itself. A fraudulent structure that would, at some point, encounter the moment that all fraudulent structures eventually encounter, the moment of contact with reality. And when that moment came, it was going to need someone to blame. I had no interest in being that person. I had a different interest entirely. What would you do, sitting where I was sitting? You've just discovered that the people who destroyed you built their empire on sand, and you have skills that they need. Drop in the comments what move you would make, because the decision I made next changed everything that followed. I got up from my desk. I walked to the window. I looked out at the city for a while. I thought about the distribution warehouse. I thought about the floor of my room in the shared house. I thought about the $4 rummage sale laptop and the grinding fan, and the 5-hour nights and 3 years of kept promises to clients who would never know what they were part of. Then I sat back down and began planning. Not planning revenge, planning architecture, the most sophisticated system I had ever designed. I want to be precise about the distinction between revenge and what I was actually doing, because I think the word revenge is too simple for what I had in mind. Revenge implies an emotion, anger, satisfaction, the visceral pleasure of watching something fall. What I was doing was structural. It was the application of the same systematic thinking that I applied to every problem I encountered. If Halcyon was a flawed system, the question was not, how do I make it fail? The question was, how do I position myself so that when it inevitably fails, I have the maximum amount of leverage over what happens next? The answer to that question, once I had framed it correctly, was almost self-evident, become indispensable to it. This required patience, This required distance. This required the suppression of every instinct that said they know who you are, they'll recognize you, this is too risky. But I had done a calculation, and the calculation was reassuring. Victor and Paige had expelled a 22-year-old student from a university 5 years earlier. They now ran a corporation with dozens of employees and hundreds of clients. Victor, in particular, struck me as the kind of person whose attention did not dwell on people he considered beneath him. And the man I had been 5 years ago, broke, expelled, carrying a battered laptop out of an apartment, was precisely the kind of person Victor considered beneath him. The man I was now was different. Different name on the company registration, different city, different context. A professional record built through small referrals and kept promises, not through university credentials. There was no reason, given what I knew about how Victor's mind worked, that he would connect Arcline Systems' founder with the student he had helped expel half a decade earlier. I needed an intermediary for the first approach. I needed Arcline to appear in Halcyon's procurement landscape not as a direct pitch, but as a natural referral, the kind of vendor that gets recommended because someone in their supply chain has worked with them and found them reliable. I spent 4 months engineering that referral. I identified 2 companies in Halcyon's client ecosystem, businesses that Halcyon served and that would, based on their own needs, benefit from the kind of infrastructure services Arcline provided. I approached both companies directly, offered favorable terms on a pilot engagement, and built systems for them that worked well enough that when they were asked by anyone, by Halcyon's procurement team, by their own network, to recommend a reliable systems vendor, Arcline would be the name they gave. This is the part of the story that people sometimes find hard to believe. So let me be specific about the timeline. The first referral from Halcyon's client network came 8 months after I began that process. Arcline received a small contract from Halcyon's procurement department, a peripheral integration job, the kind of thing that large companies outsource to small vendors because it's too minor for their internal teams and too specific for general-purpose contractors. I did the job. I did it extremely well. I documented everything. I communicated proactively. I came in under budget and ahead of schedule. 6 months later, they came back with a larger contract. I understood something from the moment that second contract arrived. I understood it in the specific architectural way that I understand systems when I am close enough to them to see their structure. Halcyon's internal technical capacity was significantly weaker than their public positioning suggested. The algorithm at their core was powerful. It was my algorithm, after all, but the infrastructure built around it was inconsistent and poorly maintained. There were gaps in their system integration, vulnerabilities in their operational architecture, dependencies that had grown over time without being properly managed. They needed someone who understood complex systems at a deep level. They needed that person to be trustworthy and affordable, and not to ask too many questions about the overall structure. I was that person, in every way that mattered, including the one they did not know about. Over the next 3 years, the relationship between Arcline Systems and Halcyon grew in a way that was, from the outside, simply the story of a reliable vendor deepening its engagement with a long-term client. From the inside, it was something more deliberate than that. I hired carefully. My team grew from Caleb and me to 12 people, all of them technically strong, all of them working on Halcyon engagements as part of a broader portfolio. I was scrupulous about one thing. No one on my team knew about my history with the company. Caleb had been with me long enough to know that I was intense about Halcyon work in a way I wasn't intense about other clients, but he attributed this to the contract size and didn't ask further. I let him attribute it to that. I built, over those 3 years, a comprehensive picture of Halcyon's internal architecture, not through industrial espionage. I want to be explicit about that, because what I was doing was legal and fully within the scope of my contracted work. They brought me in to build and maintain their systems. I built and maintained their systems. In the process of doing so, I came to understand those systems with the depth that only the person who builds something can understand it. I understood the financial reporting infrastructure. I understood where the numbers came from and how they were processed, and where the discrepancies were embedded. I understood the structure of the false contracts, not because I had gone looking for them specifically, but because building a system that processes contract data means encountering the contract data, and the data told a story that was impossible to misread once you understood what you were looking at. I documented everything, not all at once, carefully, methodically, over years. A document here, a system log there, cross-referenced with public filing data, with the client relationship patterns I could observe from my position, with the financial analysis I had done before the ArcLine engagement even began. I kept all of it on a server that only I had access to, encrypted, backed up in 3 locations, filed with the same obsessive care that I had used to preserve the original algorithm all those years earlier, when I had stood in the dark of my apartment bedroom and known that I was going to need the evidence someday. Paige and Victor never made the connection. I was certain of this, not because I was careless about the risk, but because I watched, over those years, for any sign that they had. A change in the nature of our working relationship. A question from their procurement team that felt like more than a procurement question. A shift in access, a change in contract scope. Anything that suggested they knew or suspected. There was nothing. And I understood why, because I understood them. Victor had the specific blindness of someone who has always occupied the center of every room he enters. People in the periphery of his life, vendors, contractors, service providers, were not people he thought about when they weren't directly in front of him. They existed in the category of things that work or things that need to be replaced. ArcLine worked. Therefore, ArcLine was, to Victor, something that functioned correctly and required no further consideration. Paige was more perceptive. I had always known she was perceptive, but she was not involved in the day-to-day procurement decisions. She handled the business strategy, the client relationships, the public-facing elements of the company. The operational infrastructure was below her level of attention, and perhaps, this is the thing I thought about sometimes, late at night, without any clean resolution, perhaps she had also made herself not look, because looking too carefully at certain things about Halcyon's structure would have meant seeing things she did not want to see, the false contracts, the falsified reports. The extent to which the company she had built was a performance, the extent to which the man she had chosen was, under the surface, something other than what she had bargained for. Victor, I came to understand in those years, had changed, or perhaps revealed himself more completely. His gambling had begun, at first recreational, then habitual, then in the range that quietly consumes significant money without declaring itself an emergency until it already is one. The stories filtered back through the professional world. Victor at casino events. Victor making side investments in high-risk vehicles. Victor's attitude at company meetings shifting from careless confidence to something more volatile. The corporation was still running, still reporting the numbers it needed to report, still maintaining its public posture. But at the level I could see, the internal coherence was deteriorating. The architecture was weakening. I watched it weaken. I documented it. I waited. Year 8 after the expulsion. Year 3 of the ArcLine Halcyon engagement. I received a call from Halcyon's COO, a competent, pressured man named Mr. Brooks, who had been brought in 18 months earlier in what was publicly described as a strategic operational upgrade, and what was clearly, to anyone paying attention, an attempt by the board to impose some professional structure on a company that had developed serious organizational problems. Brooks was not corrupt. He was, I believe, genuinely unaware of how deep the structural fraud went. He was trying to make a malfunctioning machine function. He told me, in the measured language of an executive disclosing a difficult situation to a vendor, that the company was going through a period of financial restructuring. He said that some contracts had experienced unforeseen complications. He said they might need to reassess their vendor relationships in the short term. "Are you terminating the ArcLine contract?" I asked. A pause. "Not at this time. but I want to be transparent with you that the situation is fluid. I appreciate the transparency, I said. Can I ask, how broad is the structural issue? Another pause, longer, broader than we'd like. I thanked him for the call. I ended it. I sat in my office for a moment. Outside, through the window, the city was doing what it always did, existing without pausing to acknowledge anything that was happening inside this room. I called my attorney. Her name was Ms. Carter, a corporate attorney who had handled Arcline's legal work for 2 years, and who was, in addition to being technically excellent, the kind of person who asked the right questions without needing to be guided to them. I told her I needed to discuss a scenario, not a current situation, but a hypothetical, a scenario in which a privately held company in a specific sector was experiencing the beginning of a financial collapse, and in which an external investor with full knowledge of that company's internal structure might be in a position to make a strategic offer. She said, "Define full knowledge of their internal structure." I said, "I mean the kind of knowledge that would allow an investor to understand exactly what the company is worth, as opposed to what they have been reporting that they're worth." A silence. "Are we talking about documented evidence?" she asked. "We're talking about a hypothetical," I said. Another silence. Then, in a hypothetical scenario of that kind, timing would be critical. The offer would need to be made at the precise moment when the company needs external capital badly enough that they cannot afford to refuse it, but before their situation becomes public enough that the offer would face regulatory scrutiny as opportunistic. What would determine that window? I asked. In the hypothetical, a failed audit, or a significant contract breach that triggers clawback clauses in their investment agreements. Either of those events would create the window. And how long would the window typically remain open? Weeks, she said. Maybe less. I thanked her and ended the call. 3 months later, Halcyon's auditor, an external firm brought in at the behest of one of their later stage investors, filed a qualified opinion on their financial statements. This is accounting language for a statement that says, "We cannot confirm that these numbers are accurate." In the business world, a qualified audit opinion is not a death sentence, but it is the kind of event that makes other investors nervous. It is the kind of event that triggers conversations about governance and oversight. It is the kind of event that, when it occurs in a company whose financials are not what they appear, tends to start pulling on threads. I had been waiting for exactly this. I named the fund Phoenix. The name was not subtle. I was not particularly interested in subtlety at this point. There is a version of this story where I kept everything anonymous until the very last moment, where Victor and Paige never knew who was behind it. That version of the story has a certain cleanliness to it. But it was not what I wanted. I had not spent 11 years working toward a version of events in which the people who destroyed my life never had to look me in the face. Phoenix Capital Partners was registered with appropriate legal structure as an investment vehicle. On paper, its principals were Ms. Carter's firm, and 2 institutional partners who understood the nature of the situation and were satisfied that the investment thesis was sound, which it was, because unlike Halcyon's inflated valuation, Phoenix's assessment of what Halcyon was actually worth, and what it could become under proper management, and with its fraudulent structure replaced by a legitimate one, was based on real analysis. The fund began making discreet inquiries through the appropriate investment banking channels. The inquiries were framed as genuine, a fund with capital to deploy, interested in technology companies in a specific sector, seeking distressed opportunities where underperforming assets could be restructured under new oversight. Halcyon's investment bankers, hungry now, given the qualified audit opinion, brought Phoenix to their clients' attention. Halcyon's clients were Victor and Paige. A meeting was scheduled. I want to tell you about the week before that meeting. I will be honest, it was not the week I had imagined in the warehouse, on the floor of that shared room, at the laptop with the grinding fan. In my imagination, in the years when imagining this was one of the things that kept me functional, I had pictured something clean, a decisive moment, a turning of tables so complete and elegant that it resolved everything. What I actually felt in the week before the meeting was something more complicated and harder to categorize. I felt the weight of the years, not with regret. I am not going to tell you I regretted any of it, because I don't, and claiming otherwise would be dishonest. But as a physical fact, 11 years of accumulated calculation and discipline and controlled anger and patient grinding work. The warehouse shifts, the grinding fan, the pasta for months, the $4 laptop, the room I packed alone on a morning when I had nothing and no one and didn't know where I was going. I had built something from that, something real, not a performance of success the way Halcyon was a performance of success. Something actual, structural, earned in the specific way that only things built from nothing are earned. I thought about Aaron, my brother who had given me money on my birthdays when he had very little of his own. I had paid him back years ago now, more than he'd given me. He hadn't wanted the money back. He'd said, "I didn't give it to you for repayment." I understood then that some debts are not financial and cannot be settled that way. I thought about my mother, who had opened a letter addressed to me and called me crying. I thought about Professor Reynolds, who had told me I had a structural instinct he had seen in perhaps 2 or 3 students in his entire career, and who had then been presented with falsified evidence of my misconduct, and had presumably concluded that he had been wrong about me. I thought about what it would mean for him to know he had not been wrong. I thought about Paige. I thought about her for a long time. I want to be truthful about this, because I think the temptation, in telling a story like this, is to arrive at the final confrontation having resolved all feeling for the person who was central to the original betrayal. To have reduced them in your own estimation to simply the antagonist, the villain, the person you're going to win against. I had not done that. Paige was not, to me, simply a villain. She was the first person I had loved. She was a person of genuine intelligence and capability who had made choices that she could not now unmake. She was also, by the time of that meeting, a woman who had spent 11 years inside a structure she had helped create, with a man she had chosen over me, watching that structure deteriorate. I did not know exactly what that had cost her. I suspected it had cost more than she had anticipated. I did not plan to be merciful. I want to be clear about that. Mercy was not on the table. But I was going to walk into that room with full awareness of the full complexity of what had happened between us, rather than with the simplified version that would have made it easier. I thought that was important. I still think it was important. I want to ask you something right now, and I genuinely want to know your answer in the comments. After 11 years of building toward a moment you've planned for and worked for and made sacrifices for, what do you think you would feel sitting in the car outside the building about to go in? Because I'd always assumed I would feel powerful, I felt something different. Drop it below. The night before the meeting, I opened my laptop. I opened the folder I had maintained for 11 years. The original development log, the first version of the algorithm, the commit history going back to the very beginning. I looked at the first entry, a timestamp from my sophomore year, a function that I had written and then rewritten 4 times before it worked the way I needed it to. I thought, this is where it started, not the betrayal, the work. The work started here, and it is still mine, and nothing that was done in the 11 years since changes what it is. I closed the laptop. I went to sleep. In the morning, I put on a suit, a good one, the kind I could not have imagined owning in the years of the warehouse and the grinding fan. And I drove to the building where the meeting was scheduled. I sat in the car for 5 minutes. Then I got out and went inside. The conference room was on the 14th floor. I had been to this building before. In my capacity as an Arcline contractor, I had visited Halcyon's offices several times, but always to a different floor, always in the role of vendor, always surrounded by the operational infrastructure that I had built and that, in those visits, confirmed what the documents told me. I knew this building the way I knew their system, from the inside out. The receptionist directed me to the conference room. I walked to it. I paused outside the glass wall of the room before I went in. Inside, at a long conference table, were 3 people. 2 of them I recognized immediately. Paige was at the near end of the table. She was, and I say this not sentimentally but as a factual observation, different from the person I had known. Not unrecognizably so. Her bearing was the same. The fundamental quality of her intelligence was still visible in the way she held herself, in the precision of her attention. But she was tired in a way that has nothing to do with sleep. She had the particular exhaustion of someone who has been managing an increasingly heavy structure for a long time, and who knows, on some level, that it is going to fall, and who has not fully decided yet whether she will fall with it. Victor was at the far end. He was heavier than he had been, less polished. The careless ease that had been so natural to him at 23 had curdled into something that looked like arrogance at a distance, and, up close, looked more like defense. His eyes, when he glanced toward the door, had the quality of someone who has been startled too many times in recent months. He was watching the door the way you watch a door when you are not entirely sure what is going to come through it. The third person was Mr. Brooks, the COO, who I knew from our professional relationship. He gave me a brief professional nod. I opened the door. I walked in. I set my briefcase on the table and sat in the chair across from them. Victor looked at me with the blank, calibrated attention of an executive meeting a potential investor for the first time, the polite, assessing look that precedes any conversation about money. Paige looked at me. For a moment, 2 seconds, maybe 3. Her expression did not change. Then something happened behind her eyes. I watched it happen. It was like watching a system receive an input it had not anticipated and take a moment to process the implications. Her face went very still. Victor was still looking at me with the polite assessment of a man who has not yet placed me. He reached across the table. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I understand you represent Phoenix Capital." I shook his hand. "I do," I said. I looked at him steadily. He was still looking at me with the polite, professional interest of someone meeting a new contact. His eyes moved over my face in the way that eyes move over faces when you are trying to place someone and failing. Then, and I watched the moment exactly, his gaze snagged. Something in the line of my jaw, or the set of my eyes, or some combination of features that had been the face of a 22-year-old in a gray hoodie on a morning 11 years ago, filtered through 11 years and a good suit and a very different context, registered somewhere in his memory. His hand, still clasped around mine, lost pressure. "I'm sorry," he said slowly. We've met before, I agreed. A pause. Paige had not moved. She had not spoken. She was looking at me across the table with an expression that was the most controlled thing I had ever seen on a human face. Controlled to the point of being almost nothing at all, which meant that everything underneath it was very large. Victor was still trying to place me. I could see the mental process, the effort of pulling something forward from a very long time ago, from a context so different from this one that the retrieval was difficult. He was not a man who thought much about the past. The past, for Victor, had always been something that resolved in his favor, and therefore did not require re-examination. I gave him time. This was deliberate. I wanted him to get there himself. I wanted the recognition to be his own. And then it happened. I saw it happen. His eyes changed. His face changed. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical shock of a film scene, but in the specific, particular way that a face changes when a person understands something they had not understood before, and will not be able to understand. "Daniel," he said. "Hello, Victor," I said. What followed was silence, not a brief pause. Silence. The kind of silence that occupies a room and does not distribute evenly, that settles differently on different people according to what they are carrying. Victor's silence was the silence of a man processing a threat he had not anticipated from a direction he had not been watching. Paige's silence was different. It was the silence of someone who has been waiting on some level, for a version of this moment for a very long time, who has known in the way that people who have done something understand that it can be discovered, that the structure she had built had a weak point in it, and has simply not known when it would be found. Mr. Brooks looked between us with the expression of a man who is beginning to understand that the meeting he thought he was in is not the meeting he is actually in. I reached into my briefcase. I placed on the table in front of me a notebook. It was old. The cover was worn, and the spine was cracked, and the pages inside were dense with the handwriting of a 20-year-old who had been working out, in cramped notations across lined paper, the first mathematical framework of a predictive systems algorithm. I had kept it for 11 years in the same external drive bag as my backup copies, a physical artifact of origin that no fabricated access log could address. "You remember this," I said. It was not a question. Paige looked at the notebook. Her expression did not change, but her hands, which had been flat on the table, moved slightly. A small, involuntary contraction. "Paige took this from my bag," I said. The week before the competition, Victor had recovered enough to begin assembling a professional posture. "I don't know what you're suggesting, but this meeting was arranged under false pretenses. Phoenix Capital made a legitimate investment inquiry through appropriate channels," I said. My voice was very even. I want to tell you that it was effortful to keep it even, and also that the effort was not very great, because I had been inside this moment in my imagination for a very long time, and the imagining had, in some way, prepared me. "I have capital to invest." "You need capital." "That is not a misrepresentation." "You're not an investor," Victor said. "You're a disgruntled former—" "I'm the CEO of Arcline Systems," I said, "which, as I think you may want to verify with your operational team, has been your critical infrastructure vendor for the past 3 years, which means I have had comprehensive access to your systems architecture and your financial processing infrastructure during that period." Silence again. Different quality this time. "I have another folder I'd like to show you," I said. I opened my laptop. I turned it to face them. On the screen was a folder structure, clean, organized, labeled by category, by date, by financial period, the kind of organization that communicates not just quantity of documentation, but the length of time over which it has been assembled. "The qualified audit opinion your firm received 3 months ago," I said, "relates to discrepancies in your revenue reporting that your auditor was able to identify but not fully characterize, because they did not have access to the internal processing architecture. I have had access to that architecture." I saw Brooks lean forward. "I have documented the structure of the false contracts, the mechanism by which certain subsidiary entities in your client network were used to generate revenue figures that do not represent arm's-length commercial transactions, the falsified reports submitted to your Series B investors, the specific financial instruments that were used in the bribery of—" "I'd like to stop you there," Victor said. His voice was controlled. I gave him credit for that. He was a person of limited depth, but he had spent his life in rooms where power was negotiated, and he understood, on an instinctive level, that the correct response to a disclosure of this kind was not panic, but the performance of composure. "Whatever you think you have," he said, "it is not what you think it is." "Okay," I said. I closed the laptop. "Then I'll send it to the Securities and Exchange Commission, and we can find out what they think it is." The composure faltered. Not completely. A fractional loss of steadiness around his eyes that I doubt anyone in the room noticed except me and possibly Paige. I said, "You have a choice to make. It is a simple choice, framed in 2 parts." I looked at Paige directly. She had not looked away from my face since the moment of recognition. This, I thought, was consistent with who she was. She had always been able to look at difficult things directly. It was one of the qualities I had admired in her, and one of the qualities that had made what she did possible. "The first option," I said, "is that Paige makes a public statement, through an appropriate channel, a regulatory filing, a media disclosure, whatever format legal counsel determines is most appropriate, in which she accurately describes the origin of the algorithm at the center of Halcyon's product and the circumstances under which I was expelled from the university 10 years ago. Neither of them spoke. The second option, I said, is that the documentation in that folder goes to the relevant regulatory authorities, and you both face a criminal investigation for large-scale financial fraud. Given the breadth and duration of the scheme and the involvement of external investors, I would expect significant federal involvement. Victor's jaw tightened. You're extorting? I'm presenting a choice, I said. The distinction matters legally, and I would encourage you to be precise about it. The room was very quiet. I let it be quiet. There is a specific quality to a silence in which power has visibly shifted, in which everyone present can feel the new arrangement of forces, even if no one is ready to name it. I'd waited a long time to be in a silence of that quality. I sat in it and let it do its work. Then I said, "There's one more thing." Victor looked at me. Paige looked at me. "I think you should also consider getting a divorce." Something moved across Victor's face. Not anger, not quite, something more complicated. He looked at Paige, and the look had something tired in it, something that had been there a long time and had stopped trying to hide itself. "We already filed the papers," he said. The words landed with the specific weight of something that has been long anticipated and is, upon arrival, still somehow surprising. I looked at Paige. Her expression was very controlled and very still, but her eyes were doing something complicated. I looked at Victor. "Then that's already decided," I said. I closed the notebook. I put it in my briefcase. I closed my laptop. "My attorney will be in touch to discuss the terms of Phoenix's investment offer," I said. "Given the current valuation of your actual, not reported assets, the offer will reflect reality. I think you'll find it still better than the alternative." I stood up. Brooks said something. I don't fully remember what. Something professional and procedural about next steps. And I nodded and gave the appropriate response. I shook hands with him. I did not look again at Victor. I looked at Paige. She had not looked away. She was still watching me with that controlled, complex expression that I had been trying to read since I walked through the door. I thought about everything I could say. About the years, about the room in the shared house and the grinding fan, and the night I stood outside a building and watched my life happen without me. About the fact that I had loved her in the specific entire way that you love something when you are 22 and you have nothing else, and it is the most real thing in your life. I said nothing. I picked up my briefcase. I walked to the door. I opened it, and I left. Before I tell you the rest, comment below. Tell me what you thought was going to happen in that room. Tell me if you've ever been in a situation where the moment you'd been building toward finally arrived and you discovered it felt different from what you'd imagined. I read every comment. I want to know. Here is what happened in the months that followed. Paige made the public statement. It came in the form of a filing with the university, a formal submission to the Academic Integrity Board, accompanied by legal documentation, in which she provided a detailed account of the circumstances surrounding my expulsion. It was a thorough account, accurate as far as I could verify. It described the origin of the algorithm, the nature of the collaboration between Victor's family and the university administration, the fabricated access logs, and the role she had played in making the evidence available to those who constructed the fabrication. I don't know what it cost her to write it. I don't know whether she wrote it because she had no other option or because, on some level, she had wanted to for a long time. I don't know whether the difference matters. The university's Academic Integrity Board reviewed the filing. They concluded after a process that took 4 months that my expulsion had been the result of fabricated evidence. My academic record was corrected. My degree was eventually formally awarded. 11 years after I should have received it. I looked at the letter for a long time when it arrived. It felt smaller than I had expected, not unimportant. It was the formal resolution of an injustice, and that had meaning. but it was a piece of paper about a life that was no longer the life I was living. The person who had needed that credential at 22, who had been expelled with nothing and no path forward, that person had found a path forward without the credential. The credential, arriving now, was evidence of something already resolved rather than resolution itself. I filed it. I went back to work. Victor's situation deteriorated significantly in the year following the meeting. The qualified audit opinion had already begun, attracting attention from investors, and the disclosure of the algorithm's origin, combined with regulatory examination of the financial reporting discrepancies that my documentation had, through appropriate channels, brought to light, created a legal situation that consumed most of his resources and attention for the better part of 2 years. The gambling debts, which I had not fully appreciated the scale of before the meeting, compounded everything. A man whose financial infrastructure was under regulatory scrutiny and whose personal fortune was simultaneously being consumed by a pattern of compulsive loss is not a man who has many options. Victor settled with regulators. He settled with investors. He paid penalties. He emerged on the other side of that process diminished in every material sense, financially, professionally, reputationally. He also emerged, as far as I could tell from the available information, without acknowledging at any point that what had happened to him was connected to anything he had done. This did not surprise me. It is very difficult to maintain for 11 years a story in which you are the protagonist and the person you wronged is simply a footnote, and then to revise that story when the footnote returns as the investor buying your company. The revision is too large. Most people in that position do not make it. Victor did not make it. I don't think about Victor much. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect me to have strong feelings about him. Hatred, triumph, satisfaction. What I feel about Victor is something closer to the feeling you have when you look at a problem that was once unsolvable and is now solved. It was solved. It is no longer a problem. I have other problems, some of which are genuinely interesting. Victor is not one of them. Paige is harder to talk about. She left the company. After the settlement and the restructuring, Phoenix's acquisition went through, at the terms my attorney had outlined, and the company was rebuilt under new management. She had no operational role to maintain. She left the industry for a time. I know this because I know her professional network, and I would have known if she had resurfaced in the technology sector. She did not resurface, not for several years. When she did, it was in a different capacity. Consulting work, smaller scale, a very different kind of profile from the executive position she had occupied. I do not know if this was choice or consequence. I suspect it was some of both. We have not spoken since the conference room. I have not sought contact. I have not wanted contact. But I have thought about her because she is the person who is hardest to think about clearly. Not because I have forgiven her. I want to be precise about this, because I think people assume that the resolution of a story like this involves forgiveness, and I don't think what I've arrived at is forgiveness in any conventional sense. It is something more like the understanding that certain damage is permanent, that the person who inflicted it was not purely malicious and was not purely good, that the reality is too complex for the clean verdict of either condemnation or absolution. She made a choice at 22 that she will carry for the rest of her life. I made choices in the 11 years after that choice that I will carry for the rest of mine. Whatever was lost between us was lost at a specific moment on a specific morning, and nothing that happened in the conference room on the 14th floor of that building restored it. It simply closed it. There is a difference between closure and restoration. I want to name that difference because I think it matters. I did not get my youth back. I did not get the 3 years I spent in a warehouse. I did not get the relationship, or the trust, or the version of myself that existed before the expulsion and that would have existed in a different form without it. Those things are gone. The conference room did not return them. What the conference room did was this. It placed the full truth in a room with the people who had benefited from the lie, and it made the lie untenable, and it made their denial impossible, and it settled something in me that had needed settling. That was what I had actually been building toward, I understood, on the drive home from that meeting. Not a dramatic reversal, not the satisfaction of watching them suffer, not the theatrical triumph of the scene I had imagined in the warehouse. The truth, formally, in a room, with witnesses. The record corrected. My work acknowledged as mine. Phoenix's restructured acquisition of the Halcyon assets was, commercially, a success. The genuine technology at the core, my algorithm, finally operating within a company whose financial reporting matched its actual performance, turned out to be as valuable as I had always believed it was. Perhaps more so. The market had developed in ways that made the application landscape broader than I had anticipated when I first conceived it. 22 years old in a university library, Arcline systems continued to operate separately. I had built it deliberately to not be dependent on the Phoenix acquisition. I had learned from the experience of having everything in a single structure. The two companies had some operational overlap, but they were separate entities with separate trajectories. I hired more people, good ones. I was, I think, a particular kind of employer, demanding, honest, and careful to acknowledge good work when I saw it. I had learned from the experience of not being acknowledged. I knew what it cost to do work that no one sees. My team grew, the company grew. The work was interesting in the specific way that difficult problems are interesting. It was not easy, and it was not satisfying in any comfortable way, but it was mine. And it made real things function better, and that was a fact rather than a performance. I think about the grinding fan sometimes, the $4 laptop, the 17 cents left in a checking account at the end of a month when the loan payment was due. I think about the floor of the room in the shared house, and the specific quality of light in that room at 3 a.m, and the way it felt to be 22 and alone, and have nothing to hold on to except the knowledge that the work was real. I hold on to something now that I didn't have then. Not certainty. I don't think certainty is possible or even particularly useful. What I have is the knowledge, tested to destruction, that I can build from nothing, that everything can be taken and I can build again, that the most powerful thing I have is not money or status or leverage, though I now have all of those things. It is the structural instinct, the ability to see, through the noise and the complexity and the falsified performance, the actual architecture of things. Professor Reynolds had told me I had it. He was right. Last thing before I close this out, and I want to be honest with you because you've sat with this story for a long time, and you deserve honesty rather than a clean rap. Sometimes I walk past places, not the warehouse, not the shared house, both of which are in a city I no longer live in, but places that have the quality of those years. A late-night building with one light on, a parking lot at 4 a.m, a diner where the coffee is bad and the people look tired in the particular way of people doing work that doesn't leave room for being anything other than tired. And I feel something, not nostalgia, not exactly, something more like recognition, the recognition of the person I was and the person those years made, and the acknowledgement that those two things cannot be fully separated, that the capability and the damage came from the same source, that I would not be who I am if it had not happened the way it happened, and also that I would have been better off if it had not happened the way it happened, and that both of those things are true at the same time and cannot be resolved. I won. Let me be clear about that. By every meaningful measure, I won. I also know things now that I did not know when I started. Things about what it costs to carry something for 11 years, about what happens to the parts of you that spend a decade and more in a controlled state of strategic patience, the suppression of feeling for the sake of function, about the fact that winning a long game does not automatically mean you know how to live without it. The notebook is on a shelf in my office. I look at it sometimes. The algorithm is in production. It runs well. I monitor it the way you monitor something you built and know intimately, aware of every parameter, every threshold, every way it might fail, and every way it might surprise you. The access card that stopped working on a morning 11 years ago is in a drawer somewhere. I kept it. I'm not sure why. Perhaps because the objects of the worst moments in your life become, over time, the evidence that you survived them. I survived it. I'm still figuring out what that means. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them. And if you've been carrying something, a long game, a wrong that wasn't righted, a work that wasn't acknowledged, I want to hear about it, because you're not alone in it, and the grinding fan isn't forever.